arrived, we can start. I'll be brief because I'm not sure, probably many of you know about Jan or know Jan. And if you don't know Jan, you'll be about to discover Jan. I think how to say it? Every time, for me personally, I listen to him, I feel enlightened, or at least a bit more enlightened. Or to put it in a more sort of contemporary language, you have many aha moments with him. And he's definitely been a huge influence for me and for the project in terms of understanding the issues that I was talking about yesterday, which many of you missed, about understanding the role of aids, official flows, and financial flows in the broader structure of global balance of payments and external accounts, and how we have to understand, the case within the larger picture. And I think since I first heard him speak in, it would have been, I think, 2003, the Cambridge Journal of Economics conference in that year that they had at Cambridge, I've always been just, ever since, continuously inspired. So I'm really honored to have him attend this symposium, and looking forward. And he's actually, I asked him to write about, why, yeah, can you combine this and that? And he said, sure, and he produced me a written text. So it's a double privilege. Just again, in terms of just the formalities, he's director of the Levy Institute, Master of Science in Economic Theory and Policy. So the Levy, of course, Institute is one of the few heterodox places still surviving in the U.S. I think more a bastion of post-Keynesian and Minskian thinking than, say, Amherst, Massachusetts. Well, the other titles aren't as real, so I'm not going to take up any more time because we're tight for time, but I'll just pass the floor to Jan. And thank you very much for being here.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. Congratulations on winning this grant. Real effort. It's very, very important in this day and age. Okay, you can see that I put on my tie, so this is I'm really serious here. And I also put on my International Civil Service suit so that everybody is sufficiently serious. To start, what I want to do is to put some background.
Oh, yeah, the mic's not very...
Hello. Hello.
Yeah, is that one okay?
Is that one better? Okay. To give some background, that's much better. Give some background context of a framework of how I'm working, and then to try to tell you the short form, the short story, rather than the long one. Obviously, what we're working on is trying to get rid of things which are unequal. Okay. And notice I said unequal, not unequal. Okay, we talk about inequalities. I don't want to talk about inequalities. We're just talking about things which are not equal. And as economists, we have great difficulty dealing with things that are unequal, because all of our policy analysis is normally framed in a model of equilibrium. Now, an equilibrium abhors unequal things, just like vacuums. Okay? What does an equilibrium do? Well, an equilibrium in a competitive product market turns all the consumers into identical people. It turns all the products into identical products. It turns all the producers into identical producers. And if you ever ask the question, what the hell would happen to this thing if people were unequal, we'd say it couldn't happen. Okay? So we do have a big difficulty, and that's the big difficulty. This microphone is dying.
I think you have to talk into this silly phone.
The box in fact works.
The box is, modern technology.
Okay, so my basic framework. My basic framework that I want to start out with is to say, really, what we're trying to do is to make things less unequal. Okay, we're trying to make things less unequal across countries. We're trying to make things less unequal within countries. Okay, and we have policies in which we try to do that. And in general, those policies don't work, or at least they haven't worked. So there is a problem, and the question is, where do we cite the problem. And if you look at most of these problems, they come from, as I said before, the fact that we base our policies in a way which we often don't notice on the assumption of equilibrium. Okay, so it's the equilibrium which is killing us here. Now, the question is there an alternative way to look at this? And the answer to that is yes, absolutely there is. Gunnar Myrdal applied an analysis to racial conditions in the United States, in which he pointed out it was absolutely normal for racial discrimination not to disappear, but in fact to become worse, in a book which he wrote, which was called The American Dilemma. Quickly after that, he probably at some stage had one of these light bulb moments when he said, well, if this works for racial discrimination, it really works everywhere. And he applied it to development and produced this idea of cumulative causation, okay? Backwash effects, spread effects, the whole deal. What are all these things explaining? They're explaining why the system, the market system, will normally not eliminate unequal things. It will make things more unequal. So what we want to do is to start out by saying, if we're going to look at the way we've fallen down, there is an alternative. Hirschman also had an alternative, with exit in voice, but I haven't got time. Andrew won't let me talk about that. To look at the way we implicitly assume equilibrium and what that does to prevent the policies that we want to use from actually achieving what we want, is to reduce things which are unequal, and then to extend that idea to certain kinds of institutions that we built into the system, which cause the system to maintain inequalities. So what we're doing is we're hunting for an equilibrium that we don't recognize as impeding the ability of our policies to function. Now, I'm going there, we've got to come out. Okay, what impedes development assistance? Okay, so here we are. Bretton Woods. Okay, everybody loves Bretton Woods. Well, we all loved Bretton Woods in the beginning, and then we discovered that, maybe it wasn't so good. Why was Bretton Woods not so good? Bretton Woods is implicitly imposing on the international system an equilibrium. Okay? Now, normally we say, what did Bretton Woods do? Well, Bretton Woods was a system to produce financial stability, stable exchange rates. We wanted stable exchange rates. Why? Because we wanted to restore some sort of fair and rules-based multilateral trading system in the post-war period. And if countries were free to fiddle with their exchange rates, you couldn't do that, because there was always going to be somebody who would cheat and try to get a leg up by engaging in a devaluation of their currency. Okay? So despite the fact that we have all of this other great stuff which is written into the Articles of Agreement, none of that stuff ever filtered down to the board of the International Monetary Fund, which was eventually created in order to produce that stability. Now, if we look at that equilibrium, the stability of exchange rates, and this is why I say it's necessary to look at the various dimensions of this equilibrium, the other dimension of that equilibrium was what? The other dimension of that equilibrium is that all countries who participate in that system more or less would have balanced current accounts over time. Why? Well, if you don't, what happens? If you don't, you run out of exchange reserves. If you run out of exchange reserves, you can't maintain your parity. So that the system implicitly, if it's going to function, is one that says either all countries are more or less similar in terms of their trading patterns and manage to reach an equilibrium over time in which their external balances are in equilibrium, or if they're not, what's going to happen? Well, if they're not, we're going to impose that equilibrium on the system. And how are we going to do that? We're going to do that by saying, well, if you can't do it yourself, and obviously the market can't do it, and this is why I'm insisting of this problem of the market not being able to produce equilibrium, we're going to impose that on the system. So the IMF is there to do what? The IMF is there to say, okay, you ran out of reserves. I'll give you some. Well, they don't really give you reserves. They do a swap. They allow you to sell your own currency at a rate which is no longer the equilibrium rate. In exchange for what? In exchange for your promise that you're going to fix things up pretty damn quick. Okay? Year and a half, 2 years. How are you going to do this? Well, there's only one and only one way to do this. You generate foreign exchange reserves by running a current account surplus. How do you get rid of that current account surplus? Well, Jacques Polak very quickly produced a system within the IMF in order to do this, and he said, in the terminology we used then, that you reduced absorption. Absorption meant what? Well, reducing absorption meant reducing domestic spending. How do you reduce domestic spending? By controlling the expansion of the money supply. Polak, good Dutchman, from the school of Marius Holtrop, recognized the importance of controlling liquidity. Controlling liquidity meant that if you did not stabilize your exchange rate, you would be required, in order to introduce, I'm going to jump now, what normally today we call austerity. Okay? Austerity was part and parcel of the stability of the international financial system. And it also, at this stage, required, more or less, that the countries that participated in that system were equals in terms of their levels of development, in terms of their production structures, in terms of their export baskets and their import needs. Now, that was fine. Why? Because there were no developing countries at Bretton Woods. Well, we had some countries that are now developing countries. These were all basically Latin American democracies, which everybody thought were more or less on their way to being industrialized. So the developing countries that we're talking about today didn't exist in 1944. Okay? We created them. International civil servants created them. Okay? The Trusteeship Council created them. Okay? All of those countries weren't there. Right? Now, if we're going to have an international financial system, and note we're saying international, that it covers all countries, then all of these new countries eventually are going to have to participate in this system. Okay? Now, if they participate in this system, what does it mean? It means that we have unequal countries, and those unequal countries are going to have to do what? They're going to have to produce some means by which they engage in some sort of exchange rate stability. Okay? How do we do that? Well, there's only one way that we do that, is that we impose, whenever these countries manage to generate a rate of expansion which allows them to industrialize by means of what Andrew called a transfer, it means that there is a very tight limit on that transfer. Okay? A country can only go over the amount of the reserves or the amount of its tranche in the IMF, which means that you can calculate that the country can grow, well, can grow not in absolute terms, but in relative terms, only X% faster than the developed countries are going to grow before they get into a position of external equilibrium. They get into that position of external equilibrium, what happens? Tack, austerity. We shut them down. Okay? Oh, sorry, you're developing too fast. The next step was to say, well, these countries really have difficulty. I should be jumping up in my slides here. These countries really have difficulty in financing this growth. So how are we going to produce growth in these countries? Well, we have Jacob Weiner, 1947, who steps up and he says, look, these guys, they're so poor they can't save. So they're never going to develop anyway. We don't have to worry about this problem. What we have to do is to get them some money. How are we going to get them money? Well, we get the World Council of Churches. The World Council of Churches says, you guys should, you rich guys should be giving them money. Then we get Kennedy, who worries about the Bay of Pigs, and he worries about Cuba. So we have a UN development decade. And basically we develop within the multilateral institutions a structure which says that if these developing countries are going to grow, we're going to have financial transfers. Okay? Now, those financial transfers are what? Well, again, we're back to our balance of payments accounting. Okay? If these countries are going to have relatively large financial transfers on capital account, okay, what does this imply about what their current account balance is going to be? Well, that current account balance is going to go negative. And that current account balance is going to go negative, and it's going to create exchange rate volatility, and it's going to drive these countries back into the fund. Okay? So, on the one hand, if we look at the original architecture of Bretton Woods, which was basically no capital flows, these were supposed to be intermediated by multilateral institutions or governments. When we decided to support developing countries, we brought those capital flows back in through the back door and implicitly created the same external disequilibria that the initial system said should never happen. Okay, we created a catch-22, a cognitive dissonance. Okay, the institutions of Bretton Woods says if you're going to have international financial stability, it means that we are putting a limit on the ability of developing countries to develop. We're putting a brake on their development. Now, that brake on development, if you're really lucky, means that it's only what we call a governor on your engine. We used to have governors on automobile engines, so you wouldn't go too fast. Okay? But in fact, what happens is it's not a question of having a governor. That is, it's not that you can't grow them more than 2% or 3%. What happens is if you go 2 or 3% and you go to 5%, suddenly you collapse. The austerity, because we're in a system that is cumulative, the austerity policies, in fact, which are meant to provide a slowdown, do more than simply stabilizing your growth rate. They push you into a decline in the growth rate, or they push you into a negative growth rate. So that if we look at the international financial system, basically the international financial system was designed for the developed countries. It was designed for stability of the developed countries. And its design, when applied to developing countries, implicitly says that it is not set up to allow developing countries to engage in the kinds of transfers that we were talking about, which they can use effectively in order to either amplify their domestic productive capacity or provide social services or social protection or whatever you want to do. Implicitly, the system will not let you do that. Now, the rest of the story is that there is an end to this story, and that end comes with Richard Nixon. Somebody talked about George W. Bush before. We do miss George W. Bush. I'm not sure we miss Richard Nixon. But Richard Nixon did one very neat thing. Okay, he got rid of the stable exchange rates. Okay, which for developing countries should have been very good. Okay, it should have provided more flexibility in the system. Unfortunately, it did not do that. It also should have shut down the IMF. Because if we don't need the IMF to lend you money for stable exchange rates, why do we need it? We don't. Okay? And as I say, unfortunately, that didn't happen either. What did happen? Well, make a long story short here, is that as a result of the petroleum crisis, we had our very nice recycling of those current account surpluses in the OPEC petroleum-producing countries that had to go somewhere, and it just happened that Latin America had sufficiently isolated itself from the rest of the world that it was growing at rates that were reasonably high. So the little gnomes of Zurich said, I can put my money into Latin America, because there was nowhere else to put it, because Europe was collapsing and the US was also collapsing. Capital flows came back, but these were now private capital flows. And since they were private flows, they did two things. First, they meant that countries that normally would have been under the tutelage of the sheriff at the IMF to make sure that they didn't grow too rapidly, now could grow as rapidly as they could convince the international bankers to lend them money. And we ended up with the external debt problem. Okay? The second part was that all of the developing countries that had had difficulty under the Bretton Woods system and had taken aid which was no longer grants as the original proposals under the UN had been, but were now hardly conditional, also found themselves with increasing external indebtedness, which they could not pay back. So that the IMF, which had existed in order to impose policies to ensure that whenever you borrowed money, you paid it back, now found a new lease on life, doing what? Becoming the debt guarantor. The IMF really, from this point on, doesn't lend a whole lot of money. What does it do? It provides what I've used from a speech by the former president of the IMF, who subsequently got into a little difficulty in Spain, running a bank. A good housekeeping seal of approval. Okay? What the IMF now did was to convince private lenders that they would get their money back, because when a country had a crisis, it would go to the IMF and the IMF would give them, pocket money. But what they would do is to impose the exact same austerity that they had used under the fixed exchange rate system to ensure the lenders that to ensure the lenders that the borrowers were creditworthy, because they were following an IMF policy. Okay? Now, we know how this worked out in Latin America. I don't have to tell that story. But the story that we really want to tell is that when it came to the problems of the least developing countries and low-income developing countries, the IMF discovered that they could do exactly the same thing. Recognizing that the structural adjustment policies that they had used in these countries were not working, they invented a whole series of additional alphabet soup, which allowed them to become the good housekeeping seal of approval for debt relief. Okay? Now, I'm sure Jubilee and all of the NGOs that supported debt relief did not realize when they did this that they were in fact just giving the IMF a new lease on life. Because what happened was that the IMF became the guarantor for donor countries for granting debt relief, that in fact that debt relief would be used for something useful. Okay? That it would be used for poverty reduction, it would be used for God knows what. Now, if you think of this for a minute, okay, I'm sure none of you have ever been bankrupt. But try and imagine yourself as a bankrupt. You cannot pay your debts, okay? And the judge tells you, I will forgive all of your debts on the condition that you use all of that money to do something else. Now, what is your first response? Your first response is, what the hell? I mean, I don't have the money. That's the point of being bankrupt. I can't do anything with it because I don't have it. So what happens? The IMF says, okay, we'll give you some money. Or the donor country says, I'll give you some money. Okay? And the condition of having that money is what? The condition of having that money is that you adopt exactly the same conditionality in macro terms that we have always used from the time of Jacques Pollack to today. Which means what? Which means reducing absorption in terms of reducing fiscal expenditures. Deficits go down, or you must run a surplus. You must have money supply controls. And in fact, we're also going to add some little bells and whistles. Little bells and whistles like the size of the government has to go down because governments are no good and they're inefficient and they're corrupt. We had a guy from the bank who came on who added that corruption thing. Okay? In addition, we're going to say, we're going to put some additional conditions here in order to make you feel better, to make it look like this debt relief is doing something for you. And this is when we created the PRGF, which provided the money, and the PRSPs, which said that don't feel like we're forcing you to do this, you're going to do it on your own. Okay, we heard yesterday and today the way in which these PRSPs were developed. Now, it's not only a question of the size of the paper. In fact, every once in a while they would forget to change the country name in the PRSPs. And this is not a joke. Okay? Now, those PRSPs were what? Those PRSPs were, in fact, the same old IMF conditionality that we have always had. Now, if we take seriously the idea that there was a move towards targeted or directed social programs in order to, you can name whatever you want, to reduce poverty, to get female children into schools, you pick anything you want. AIDS reduction, for example, okay? AIDS eradication. Any of these particular programs in which you could generate sufficient NGO support to bring about money, okay? As a result of the implicit conditionality within the PRSPs or any of the lending, it became impossible to implement those strategies. Okay? Impossible why? It became impossible for a very simple reason, we went through this yesterday, is that when an NGO provides support, financial support for the program, that financial support for the program eventually has to be spent, and virtually always it is spent in terms of local currency, except for Jimmy's areas of dollar exchange, but in general, it goes into local currency. If it goes into local currency, it means that either the money supply goes up, and if it goes up beyond the target that's in the conditionality, it can't be spent. Where does it go? It goes into reserves. Okay? AIDS eradication ends up building up the reserve base of the central bank. Or if you have to hire more people in order to do this, and you do this through a government organized health service, it means that you can't hire the people because you have limits on the number of employees that you can have in the public sector. Okay? There are a whole series of ways in which this money eventually, well, not eventually, more than eventually, initially gets stuck and in fact doesn't come out. Okay? It cannot be used. So we say, aid doesn't work. Well, of course aid doesn't work. It doesn't work if it never manages to get to where it is supposed to have an impact. If it never manages to get to where the inequality is supposed to be reduced. Now, this is something that, there's our good housekeeping conditionality. If we look, and now I'm going to read from a couple of pieces which I picked up at random. This was something that when I was working at in the UN, first at UNCTAD and then at DESA, which caused us a great deal of consternation to try to explain to people that if you gave money to a country that probably it would not get implemented in terms of the objectives that you wanted. And the question is why? Well, simple quotation. The IMF appears to believe that participation, and this is participation in a PRSP program and a PGRF loan, will not challenge program content. And they're talking about the loan program content. Okay? It will not lead to radically different programs being formulated. It would simply give civil society a better understanding of why IMF-style reforms are necessary and thus ownership of them. Okay? We're saying, we're giving you debt relief. You haven't got the money. We're going to force you to spend it on something that, in fact, is never actually recipient of that money, but you're going to like it. Because you're going to see that your ownership is going to make you feel better. We can keep going. Macro conditionality survived the PRSPs. Okay, the macroeconomic and structural reform policy contents of the 30 completed PRSPs, this comes from a Francis Stewart paper, which reveals that there is no fundamental departure from the kind of policy advice provided under earlier structural adjustment programs. Current policies contain all the elements of the first generation of policy reforms designed to promote the role of the market, to get prices right, and blah, 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 blah. You all know the drill. I don't have to read this for you. You've seen it 100 times. Okay? Uganda. Uganda was one of the first countries in which this became obvious, in which it occurred. And we have now quite clear evidence of this. If I can see this long enough to read it. Finance ministry official, this is the finance minister, noted the constraints set by the fact that ceilings for overall health spending in the economy and its impact on the rate of growth of the money supply, i.e. inflation, had already been set for the medium-term expenditure framework. Their concern that was, and these are the external advice, the IMF advisors, their concern that was even if the funds were off budget, if some were spent on wages in the domestic economy's money supply, this could still be inflationary. The decision had already been made in the minds of the IMF and finance ministry that it was better to prioritize maintaining the very low inflation rate over other needs, such as funding for HIV/AIDS. Such fatal calculations led Professor Francis Omawa to note that the IMF, World Bank, and Ugandan Finance Ministry have decided that protecting against inflation is more important than protecting people's lives, referring to the many thousands of Ugandans who die each year unnecessarily because of a lack of treatment for preventable diseases and curable illnesses. Okay, this is not invention. It actually happens. I mean, these are not stories that we come up with. So, basically, where do we end up? Development assistance fights with macro stability. It fights with international financial stability. Okay? These are two things that, under the equilibrium conditions, cannot exist. We imposed an equilibrium on the international financial system. We imposed an equilibrium on the domestic system. And both of those imposed equilibria prevent the introduction of measures which will, in fact, reduce the unequal positions within society. Last point. How have I got? I've got 2 minutes. I'll do this very quickly. Jomo has recently produced a paper. He's now living again in Malaysia, and he's complaining of the fact that the World Bank has downgraded Malaysia in its Better Business Conditions Index, or whatever it is. Okay? This is just to show that this sort of cognitive dissonance exists throughout the application of multilateral projects. And his argument, he says, well, really what happened, they got downgraded because, in fact, what happened is that Malaysia introduced a better tax regime so that companies would, in fact, pay tax. Okay, we heard a little bit earlier today about the importance of reducing tax evasion. Well, the problem is that this makes it much more difficult for companies to become companies so that your business condition index gets worse. Because if you make them pay tax, then they're not so efficient and they don't do such a good job in development. Okay? Again, complete cognitive dissonance implied here. One side of the bank is saying one thing, the other side of the bank is saying the other thing. Now, we need, oops, wait a minute. What did I do? What did I do?
Yeah, I think you must be pressing something.
Yeah, I'm okay. I'm back.
Yeah,
I'm back.
okay.
I'm back to position, I think. No, I'm not back to position. That's okay, I can remember. Anyway, the main point in Jomo's piece is the point that we started out with. The problems of having unequal participants in the system. I mean, basically the criticism that the piece makes is that applying a common framework to assessing the appropriate methods for providing good business conditions depend on peculiarities in the particular countries. And using an index which is more or less common to everybody ends up with things that are basically stupid. Okay? Now, the last piece and the last slide, which I can't get to because somebody has, I don't know why this one.
Your elbow on the delete button or something.
Oh, I may have deleted it all. Okay. No, the last thing that I wanted to say is that throughout all of this discussion, we ended up talking about a number of ways in which equilibrium and the way this system prevents the elimination of unequal positions. The one piece that runs throughout all of this is what? Well, the beginning of the Bretton Woods system was that private capital transfers would be kept to an absolute minimum, and they would be intermediated by governments or by multilateral institutions. God help us that should ever happen. Okay? All of the problems that we've talked about are in some sense a disturbance of the system that results from capital transfers. So that if we're thinking about using those financial transfers in order to bring about the support, and here, whether it's domestic industrialization or whether it's your social protection or whatever, says that we have to think very, very carefully about whether or not it is sensible to do it that way. Is there an alternative? And as Andrew mentioned yesterday, for a large proportion of these things, it is not necessary. Okay? Developing countries are not resource poor. Developing countries are not savings poor. We talked about Korea yesterday. If you go back to Korea in the 1950s, their savings rate was what, 5%, 4%, 6%, something like that. Within a space of 15 years, Korean savings rate was 20, 30%, and eventually it got up to, now we used to, in the 1980s and the 1990s, we used to look at these countries and say, my God, they've got savings ratios of 60%. Now, this is just nuts. Well, it was nuts. Okay? But it's not the domestic savings. So the question is, can we finance these things domestically? And the answer is yes, you can. Okay? There's nothing that prevents you from doing this except the fact, number one, that you have already tried and you have external debt, which means that you have to repay that external debt, and that does put a limit on your ability to finance domestically. So that if you are looking at effective debt relief means what? Effective debt relief means paying it back so you don't have to borrow any more. And you can use your domestic financial system in order to finance these particular measures. Now, as you may know, at Levy we make a big deal out of domestic financing and the fact that countries with monetary sovereignty do have the ability to finance a large proportion of their development needs. I won't say all of them. Okay, we still have to buy machines from Germany and medical equipment from Japan. But those are probably the only two things that you really need. Most of the rest of it, okay, you can finance domestically. So that the end of the story is, okay, why is it so difficult for these measures to succeed? They're so difficult because implicitly we have created a system in which it is virtually impossible for them to succeed. And unless we change that system, it's not going to work. And this is why the project that you're working on, which attempts to take into account these external factors on the domestic development process, is really very, very important, because it means learning how to look at these things outside of the context of the individual micro-project, and to look at the project in terms of the overall system in which it exists. So, I almost made it. Sorry. Thank you.
I suppose after a talk like that, I'm not sure If yes, okay. Let's have a few questions. Heske and Cape, and oh.
Hi, Jan. Nice to meet you again. About 20 years of being away from each other. When I listened to your presentation about Bretton Woods system, particularly IMF fixed exchange rate system, I think I'm very critical to the Bretton Woods system, but when I'm reading the articles of agreement in Bretton Woods, the system is not as bad as people think it is, because it is actually the act following the articles of agreement are not really fully followed. Very important concept of scarce currency clause, that is, responsibility should be shared between a surplus country and a deficit country, has to be done. And Keynes fought hard for that, but never being implemented. So if they are willing to impose the responsibility of a surplus country to take more expansionary policy, then a task for the IMF to imposing such an austerity policy to a deficit country should be smaller. If that would be in the case, I think the whole trouble of the breaking down of the Bretton Woods system could have been avoided. I mean, that's the thought, among others. But this is that.
First of all, talk to Germany.
Oh, sorry, the mic, right? Of course. We could throw it to you.
Okay, first of all, talk to Germany. Okay, and number two, as I mentioned before, the things that were written in the Articles of Agreement were there because there was a different plan that was supposed to come out. They stayed there, but it's impossible for the IMF to satisfy those conditions. The only way that would have been true is if everybody would have stayed more or less at an external equilibrium. And if Hirschman was right, or if Myrdal was right, that the system naturally produces large disequilibria, okay, it was fine to write it into the Articles of Agreement, but you were basing that on a theoretical model that would not and could not produce the results that were required in order to make this system work.
And oh, you want help? Okay. So Heske, and then Jomo, and then Isabel, and then Aisha. We'll take it around. We've only got 7 minutes.
Yeah.
You don't want the chef to get
Yeah. My first question was more or less the same as you asked, but I don't know if I understand the answer, because originally the idea was that the IMF would also put conditions on the surplus countries, and why did that not happen? And the second thing is, in the end, you hinted a little bit about possible solutions, but could you say a bit more about that? Because it seems that you would want to curb the private banking system, because that would be perhaps the only solution. But maybe you have other ideas. Thanks.
We'll just take some more. So next is Jomo. It's a long shot. I don't know if you're a football player.
Let me rehabilitate Nixon. I suggested the other day that he was the last Keynesian president, and today I would like to suggest that he might be the first and last pro-development president. By substituting flexible exchange rates, you have, given the inherent biases which you correctly described, you will have a currency undervaluation, which would be potentially developmental. The second point I would make is that you would then have to conclude, given the logic of your title, that Michel Camdessous, by encouraging financial globalization, that's how it's often referred to, basically, as managing director of the IMF, has basically undermined international financial stability.
Okay, on that thought, Isabel and Aisha, and then Rob, and then it's got to be very short though.
So thank you, Jan, for a fantastic presentation. Really has been very inspiring, and it's great historical overview in very few minutes. So much appreciated. But actually, as Jan Kregel was speaking, I was thinking about the research. Yeah. So you see, for the research, because the focus has been on cash transfers, it's difficult to introduce all the topics that Jan was mentioning. However, if you expand and again talk about the systems and include also, the contributory side of social protection, then you are there. You can talk about the IMF and all the reforms that are being done at the moment that generally include, cuts on the wage bill, reduction of subsidies, pension reforms, and all. So your research, I think, will be much more enriched because you will add the angle of the IMF.
Okay, so that was a question to me, actually.
I'm so glad that it will not be thrown. Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering whether we should not be discussing the IMF along with the World Trade Organization. Oh, yeah. I kept thinking about TRIPS as you were talking about the financial strains. I mean, as long as the TRIPS are there, can we hope for an independent, autonomous industrialization strategy? Thank you.
Very briefly, Rob.
I won't throw it.
Okay, I will hardly dare to ask a question, but thanks, Jan. It was enlightening. I thought I knew all this stuff, but it was still enlightening. Basically, the short question is, go back to the title, right? It's international financial stability versus international development assistance. So you talked about what's wrong, right? Now, what should we do moving forward that international financial stability equals or promotes international development assistance?
Shall I say something very briefly in response to Isabel? No? Okay. We can talk about that later.
If you could say briefly. Okay, we'll try to be very quick. We'll go first to the bank and the WTO. Clearly, they do play a very major role in this, but in half an hour we couldn't really deal with them. The bank, to a certain extent, is even worse. Okay, than the fund in these cases. I'll just do one example. When Argentina was doing its structural adjustment, or whatever you want to call it, in the beginning of the 90s, the bank produced a report which justified the unilateral elimination, okay, of tariffs on Argentinian goods. Okay, not MFN, unilateral. They just got rid of it. Why? On the basis of a World Bank study that was produced in an econometric model that assumed that the Argentinian external balance was in equilibrium. Okay? Think about that for 3 seconds. Okay? So this is the point I'm trying to make. Once you have absorbed this idea that the system automatically goes to equilibrium, you're done. Okay? There's no way that you're going to ever get anything out of this system, even if you're trying to do so. And I presume that the bank had the best intentions. And this is back to the question of why it doesn't work. Why doesn't the system work? Because, in fact, it's not in equilibrium, and it's not going to equilibrium. Okay? Part of the difficulty that we have a lot of stories about what happens to a system when it gets displaced from equilibrium. Okay, go back to my perfectly competitive story. The producer that has, price which is too high or a price which is too low, he either adapts or he's eliminated. Back to Hirschman's sort of exit and voice. We don't have a story of how systems get into equilibrium. Okay? And if we believe those people who talk about dynamic processes, Schumpeter or whoever, it says that it's really impossible to do this because the system never gets there. I some 30 years ago, wrote a paper about Keynes and what I called shifting equilibrium. Okay? Equilibrium is not a state which you can use in order to formulate policy. Okay? You formulate policies in order to generate movements towards something, but it's not towards an equilibrium. Okay? So as I responded to Cape, I said, okay, that's fine. Go and talk to the Germans and convince them that they should, step up. We've seen what that response is. Why in the world should we do anything? Because it's going great for us, so why don't we have everybody else do it? Okay? The same thing happened with the United States. We know of the problem of the dollar shortage, and the United States says, well, everything's going great for us. You guys, figure it out. You can do it too. Well, you can't. And that's why the system breaks down. To give an example, let's say, for example, and now we go to Cape and the Keynes plan. Say we had the Keynes plan, okay? China. What do we do with China? We go to China and say, well, sorry, your external surplus is too high. We're going to penalize you for having developed too rapidly. Chinese are going to look at us and say, are you people out of your mind? An example closer to home, Ireland. Okay, Ireland, well, not Ireland before the crisis, Ireland 15 years ago, when it was expanding relatively rapidly. What happened? The Commission went to Ireland and said, look, you guys have got to introduce fiscal austerity because you're growing too rapidly. Okay? And if you're an Irishman and you have any conception of Irish history, you just go, I can't believe this. This is nuts. Okay? And that's even the Keynes plan, which I like a lot. Okay? So, yeah, Jomo is absolutely right. I wasn't criticizing Nixon for that purpose. There were other aspects of his character which were not particularly. But now we now learn that he was exemplary in terms of his, well, we'll leave that to one side. Absolutely true. The flexible rates did manage to get you to do that, but the difficulty was that if you had used those rates, the freedom that you had with those rates, say you had used a policy of developmental exchange rates, okay, what would have happened? Eventually, again, if you had been too successful, you would have been shut down. Okay? So the idea was that within this sort of system, as long as you're always staying within some sort of equilibrium range, you're always going to be penalizing someone. So we're down to the last question, which is, Rob, what do we do? Well, and also the question, the other question of what do we do? Well, the first possibility, about a year ago, I produced a piece which criticized the proposals for substituting the dollar. Substituting the dollar is not going to solve the problem. Putting the SDRs in place is not going to solve the problem. The problem is what? The basic problem is that the IMF does not create liquidity the way it is currently set up. And nobody wants it to create liquidity the way it is currently set up. The Keynes plan does create liquidity, but the Keynes plan has countries that are too unequal participating in it. So my proposal was, let's go to a regional Keynes plan. Do a regional clearing union where the countries are on relatively similar degrees of development and allow that liquidity to be created by a possibility of getting some sort of widespread agreement, okay, on the implementation of that sort of system. You bring back flexible exchange rates, so you don't need the exchange rate flexibility in order to eliminate divergences. You have the domestic liquidity, well, the regional liquidity created by the system, which eventually then becomes domestic liquidity, and you don't have to borrow because you are creating your own liquidity. Every deficit country is borrowing from the surplus country as long as within the system you have agreement. So this is the only solution that I can come up with, because I really do not believe that Germany is ever going to play the game the way Cape suggests that the game should be played. And I don't know, Gary told us a lot about global multilateral agreement systems. I'm sorry, I just do not believe in those, and I didn't believe in those before Mr. Trump came on the scene, and after Mr. Trump is on the scene, it's pretty clear that those sorts of agreements are not something that we're going to see in the very near future.
Thank you so much.